The calm before the storm. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the small town of Cedar Valley. The streets were peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the rhythm of life moved slowly and steadily. People sat on their porches, sipping iced tea, while the hum of crickets filled the air. Nestled on the edge of town was a humble yet beloved spot, Betty's Diner, a quaint roadside eatery famous for its hearty breakfasts and the kind of comfort food that made you feel like you were at home. The familiar chime of the door's bell signaled the arrival of customers, and the chatter of locals, mixed with the soft sound of an old country tune playing on the jukebox, filled the air. Inside, the diner exuded warmth, both from the friendly staff and the cozy interior. Its checkered floors were worn but polished, and the old-fashioned booths offered a sense of nostalgia. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, weaving its way through the room, making the regulars smile in contentment as they chatted about their day. At the counter, a woman sat alone, her posture poised and composed. Maya Caldwell had the kind of elegance that seemed effortless, though anyone who truly knew her would recognize the strength that lay beneath her calm demeanor. Her sharp eyes scanned the room with quiet vigilance, taking in the faces of the diners around her as she stirred her coffee. She wasn't one to stand out, not in a place like this, but that didn't mean she was unnoticed. There was something about her, an air of confidence that drew the eye without her trying. Maya had lived a life that had shaped her in ways most couldn't imagine. Retired from the military, decorated for her service, she had seen the worst of humanity, but carried herself with the grace of someone who had long since mastered the art of control. It was that same control that kept her calm now as she sat alone, a cup of coffee in hand, her thoughts her own. She wasn't in the mood for excitement, for drama, but she had learned long ago that you couldn't always control when it came to find you. And today, it seemed, was one of those days. The familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance grew louder, a disruptive sound in the otherwise serene town. Maya's attention shifted toward the window as the group of bikers pulled into the gravel parking lot, their engines roaring to a halt. The bikes, gleaming black and chrome, were an immediate contrast to the soft, rural charm of the diner. The leather-clad figures dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds, and their laughter echoed through the quiet afternoon. The group of 6 men strode into the diner, their laughter brash and too loud for the cozy atmosphere. The regulars at the counter shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced down at their plates, others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared say a word. The bikers had a presence, a rough, intimidating air that made the whole room feel smaller. Maya, however, didn't flinch. She continued sipping her coffee, her expression unreadable. The leader of the group, a towering man with a scruffy beard and sunglasses perched on top of his head, scanned the room. His eyes swept over the diners, sizing them up, before landing on Maya. A smirk spread across his face as he elbowed the man next to him, nudging him with an exaggerated motion. His voice, thick with mockery, carried across the room. "Looks like someone wandered into the wrong place," he muttered, loud enough for Maya to hear. Maya didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady on the man, the corner of her lips barely twitching as she continued to stir her coffee. She was used to the judgment, the looks, the whispered comments. None of it had any power over her, but she was aware. She was always aware. The man's laughter grew louder, more mocking, and he took a step toward her. His friends followed suit, their heavy boots clanging on the tile floor. Maya could feel the shift in the room, an air of tension that hung like smoke. The diner staff hesitated behind the counter, unsure of how to react. The other patrons avoided eye contact, hoping to stay out of it. But it was clear. The bikers had no intention of leaving without making their presence known. The leader leaned over the counter, his eyes never leaving Maya as he addressed her directly. "Hey, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You sure this is your kind of place?" The room seemed to hold its breath. The din of the jukebox and the clink of silverware faded into the background. For a moment, Maya didn't speak. She simply set her spoon down with deliberate precision, the soft sound of the metal against the ceramic mug almost too loud in the silence. "You really want to do this here?" Maya's voice was quiet, but it held an undeniable authority. The calmness in her tone was not an invitation, but a warning. The man faltered for a moment, clearly thrown by her composed response. His grin wavered, and the air of cocky confidence around him began to crack. But only for a second. Then it returned, stronger than ever, as if his pride refused to let him back down. "Oh, we got ourselves a tough one, huh?" The leader's voice was mockingly sweet now. "What are you gonna do? Call the cops?" His friends chuckled, the sound grating against the uneasy silence. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Before he could take another step, Maya's hand moved with surgical precision. In one swift motion, she grabbed his wrist, twisting it with a speed that betrayed her experience. The suddenness of the move caught him completely off guard. He let out a sharp hiss of pain, his bravado faltering as his hand shot back, rubbing his wrist in disbelief. Maya's voice was low, but firm. "You don't want to do this." For a moment, the biker leader froze. He was caught off guard, his ego bruised, and his friends stood still, unsure of how to proceed. But just as quickly as his confidence had faltered, it returned with force. He sneered, trying to shake off the embarrassment. "Big mistake, lady," he growled, his voice laced with venom. But before he could make another move, the door to the diner opened again, this time with purpose. A tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit strode in, his presence immediately commanding attention. The room shifted in the blink of an eye, as the atmosphere changed from one of tension to one of quiet anticipation. The man walked toward Maya with a sense of quiet confidence, his gaze flicking briefly to the group of bikers before landing on her. "You okay, Maya?" His voice was calm, steady, a stark contrast to the rough chaos that had just erupted. Maya didn't take her eyes off the leader, though she replied without missing a beat. "I'm fine, Darren." The man, Darren, turned to face the bikers, his expression unreadable, but his posture, strong, broad, and unyielding, spoke volumes. The bikers, sensing the shift in the air, seemed to hesitate for the first time since they had entered the diner. "You gentlemen need to leave." Darren's voice was quiet but authoritative. The leader of the bikers tried to laugh it off, but it was clear that his confidence had started to waver. "Who you think you are, buddy? Her bodyguard?" He mocked, trying to regain some semblance of control. Darren's lips twitched slightly, but it was more of a sad smile than anything else. "Something like that," he replied calmly. He pulled out a phone, the action deliberate, as if waiting for the next move. His finger hovered over the screen, and the tension in the room thickened as the bikers exchanged wary glances. "You don't want to find out the hard way," Darren added, his tone carrying an unspoken threat. The tension was palpable. Everyone in the diner had become a spectator, watching, waiting, wondering how this would unfold. Maya sat back, her hands clasped around her coffee cup, her calm presence like a steady anchor amidst the brewing storm. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she wasn't afraid to face it when it found her. The bikers had picked the wrong woman to mess with, and they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. A showdown of wills. The din of conversation, the clink of silverware, and the occasional cough filled the air. But they were all muffled by the tension now hanging thick in the diner. Every patron was acutely aware of the scene unfolding before them. The 6 bikers, once loud and brash, stood motionless as the calm presence of Maya and Darren began to tighten around them like a vice. The leader, still clutching his wrist, glared at Darren, his eyes narrowing into slits. The smirk he wore earlier had melted into something more dangerous, an uncomfortable mix of confusion and anger. His hand tightened into a fist as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his boots scraping against the floor. His friends, sensing their leader's discomfort, exchanged glances. The once boisterous energy of the group was fading, replaced by a lingering uncertainty. It was clear now that they had made a miscalculation. The diner's small, cozy interior seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of the moment. A few of the regulars began to shift uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting between Maya and the bikers, but no one dared to speak. The staff at the counter exchanged nervous looks, unsure of what would happen next. "Listen, pal," the leader finally spat, his voice trembling with frustration. "We're just here to have some fun. Ain't no need to make this more than it is." His attempt to regain control was feeble. The words hung in the air like stale smoke, but they didn't have the same weight they once did. The room wasn't buying it. The aura of authority that had once surrounded the bikers had completely dissipated, replaced by the cold steel of Darren's calm composure. Darren's eyes remained steady, unwavering as he stared down the biker leader. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone spoke volumes. He didn't have to prove anything to these men. His confidence came from a place of deep understanding of how people like them operated. He had spent years in a world that demanded respect, not through words, but through actions. And these men, loud and imposing as they were, weren't accustomed to the kind of resistance that Maya and Darren presented. "Then I suggest you leave." Darren's voice was calm, almost detached, as though the whole situation were already decided. His gaze flickered to the rest of the bikers, who were now looking at each other uneasily. The silence stretched on, almost suffocating in its intensity. The leader shifted again, his hands twitching at his sides, as if deciding whether to make a rash move. But Darren's gaze was unwavering, and the faintest flicker of doubt in the biker leader's eyes was impossible to miss. "What's the matter? You too scared to back up your words?" The biker leader spat again, trying to save face in front of his group, though it was clear his bravado was cracking. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't need to speak to remind them that words, empty and hollow, meant nothing in a room where power was something you earned with every movement, every decision. Darren's eyes flashed briefly toward her. Maya wasn't a passive observer in all of this. She had the kind of presence that radiated strength, and her silence was as commanding as any spoken word. He knew she wasn't the type to shy away from confrontation. She had been trained to handle much more dangerous situations than this. "Let's go, man," one of the bikers behind the leader muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The nervousness in his tone was palpable, and it seemed to spread like a virus to the others. It was clear the group was starting to buckle under the pressure of the situation, and their leader's authority over them was starting to falter. Maya, however, remained as composed as ever, her eyes never leaving the leader's face. "You know," Maya began, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a knife, "you picked the wrong place, and you picked the wrong woman to mess with." Her voice was steady and firm, but there was a noticeable edge to it now. She stepped forward, her every movement deliberate, controlled, as though she were in total command of the situation. She was not the type to be intimidated, not by men like these. She had fought bigger battles, in places darker than this small diner, and she had never lost. "You think you can come into a place like this, show disrespect to people who have worked hard all their lives, and just walk out like nothing happened?" Maya's voice rang out, every word carefully chosen, each syllable weighted with purpose. The leader, taken aback by her calm yet powerful words, stammered for a moment, then tried to regain his composure. But it was too late. His attempt to assert dominance over the room had backfired, and now he was the one on the defensive. His eyes darted around, searching for support, but the rest of his crew was growing more uneasy by the second. "You're really going to stand there and try to act tough in front of all these people?" Maya continued, her tone unwavering. "You think they're afraid of you?" The other patrons, who had been silently watching, began to shift in their seats, emboldened by her words. The woman who had been sitting at the corner booth, clutching her coffee nervously, now straightened in her seat, her eyes flashing with defiance. An older man, his weathered face crinkling with a smile, gave Maya a thumbs up, his eyes twinkling with admiration. Maya's words were resonating with them, because they too had seen people like these bikers, loud and obnoxious, trying to impose their will on others. But Maya wasn't letting it happen, and neither would anyone else in the room. Darren, sensing that the bikers were on the verge of collapsing into submission, stepped closer to Maya. His tall frame towered over her, protective but not possessive, his presence a steady force that grounded the entire situation. He didn't need to say a word. His calm was enough. The leader's face twisted with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His attempts at bravado were slipping, and he could see that the situation was quickly spiraling out of his control. He tried once more to salvage some measure of pride. All right, he muttered, holding up his hands in mock surrender. We were just having a laugh. No harm done, right? His voice was shrill now, laced with desperation. Maya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the space between them until the leader was forced to look her in the eyes. Her gaze was unflinching, direct, and utterly unyielding. You really think an apology like that is going to cut it? She asked, her voice cold as ice. The man flinched, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. His friends, who had been egging him on only moments before, were now standing behind him, looking at the ground, ashamed of the scene they had caused. Maya's eyes softened just slightly as she took another step closer. You came in here thinking you could intimidate people because of the way you look, the way you speak, the way you act. But you're wrong. And now you're going to apologize properly to everyone in this room. The silence that followed was thick. The leader looked around, his pride wounded, but he could feel the weight of Maya's words pressing down on him, each one pushing him further into submission. The air in the diner shifted again, this time with the unmistakable sense of resolution. The bikers exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances, and one by one, they began to back down. I'm sorry, the leader muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. He cut himself off, realizing how hollow the apology sounded. Maya didn't flinch, her gaze still steady. Louder, she commanded. The leader's jaw clenched, but there was no escape from the inevitable now. I'm sorry, he said again, this time louder, his voice tinged with resentment. The rest of the bikers, seeing their leader relent, followed suit. Each one, though begrudgingly, mumbled their apologies, their voices dripping with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Maya stepped back, her expression still unreadable, though there was a subtle sense of satisfaction in the air as the bikers, having finally realized their mistake, shuffled toward the door. As the last of them left, Darren turned to the diner's staff, his expression softening. Don't worry, he said calmly. If they come back, call this number. He slid a card across the counter, his eyes meeting the diner owner's grateful gaze. We'll take care of it. The owner nodded, visibly relieved, as the tension in the room began to ease. The staff resumed their duties, and the chatter slowly returned, though it was tinged with awe. People spoke in low voices, marveling at what they had just witnessed. The rest of the patrons, emboldened by Maya's strength and determination, resumed their meals, their conversations picking up once more. Maya took her seat again at the counter, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. Darren joined her, his gaze softening. You know, he said, breaking the silence, one day you're going to have to stop putting yourself in these situations. Maya chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling with amusement. And miss all the fun, she teased. Darren sighed, shaking his head, but a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Sometimes I wonder how you do it, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Maya gave him a sidelong glance. You know how I do it. I've been trained for this my whole life. And with that, she sipped her coffee, her calm and unshakable composure once again the centerpiece of the room. The diner's atmosphere, though still buzzing with the aftermath of the altercation, had returned to its normal rhythm, and life, slow, steady, and uncomplicated, continued on. A heart of resilience. The tension in the diner had dissipated, but the air still carried an undeniable charge. The bikers had slunk out, their bravado shattered, and the regulars who had witnessed the scene now sat in a mix of awe and admiration. The morning's quiet had been replaced with hushed conversations and murmurs of praise for Maya and Darren. There was a shared understanding that something extraordinary had happened in their little corner of Cedar Valley, and they had been witnesses to it. For Maya, however, the encounter was already fading into the background. She had dealt with men like those bikers before, bullies, predators, men who thought their size and roughness could impose fear on others. It wasn't the first time she had stood up for herself or for others, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But there was something about this moment that lingered in her mind, a reminder of the path she had walked and the strength it took to walk it every single day. Darren sat beside her at the counter, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his eyes still alert. His calm demeanor had a way of putting people at ease, but Maya knew him too well to miss the slight tension in his posture. His protective instinct was a constant in his life, something that had served both of them well through many difficult situations. "You know," Darren began, his voice casual, but with a depth of concern that Maya had come to recognize. "I don't know what it is about you, but every time you walk into a room, something happens. You really can't go anywhere without stirring up a storm." Maya smiled, though there was a faint sadness in her eyes. She was used to this, used to the way people reacted to her presence, the way her history seemed to have a life of its own. "You think I like it?" Maya asked, her voice light but sharp. "You think I want to be the center of attention? The truth is, Darren, I don't have a choice. When you live the life I've lived, you don't get to just slip into the background. People notice you. They always do." Darren frowned, his brow furrowing as he looked at her. He had known Maya for years, but even now there were parts of her story that remained locked away, buried beneath the layers of her military past. He knew she had seen things, horrible things, things that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. But he also knew that Maya had something in her that very few people had, an unbreakable resolve, a fire that could never be extinguished. "Not everyone notices you for the right reasons," he said softly, his voice more of a statement than a question. Maya's gaze softened, and she nodded. "I know, but I can't control how people see me. I can only control what I do about it." She took a deep breath, turning her eyes back to the door, watching as the last of the bikers disappeared down the street. "Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it, you know. All the battles I've fought. All the times I've had to prove myself just to be seen as equal. Sometimes it feels like it's never enough." The words hung in the air, weighted with a vulnerability that Maya rarely allowed anyone to see. She had always been strong, always been the one to protect others. But that didn't mean she didn't carry her own burdens. It didn't mean she didn't get tired, didn't long for the days when she could just be, without the constant pressure of proving herself. Darren's expression softened, and he leaned in slightly, his voice low. "You don't have to keep proving anything, Maya. Not to me. Not to anyone. You've done more than enough." Maya smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She had always been grateful for Darren's unwavering support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there would always be something more to prove. It was part of who she was now, a result of years of fighting not just for her own survival, but for the survival of the values she held dear. "You know, I used to think the military would be the hardest thing I'd ever do," Maya said, her voice almost a whisper. "But then I came home. I came back to a world that didn't know me, that couldn't understand me. And suddenly I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was just Maya. And that was the hardest transition I've ever had to make." Darren remained silent, knowing that this was one of the rare times Maya would allow herself to open up about her past. She wasn't the type to dwell on what she had lost or what she had been through. But every once in a while, when the weight of the world pressed down on her, she would talk, and he would listen. "It's like I'm constantly at war with myself," Maya continued, her eyes distant now. "Part of me wants to move on, to find peace, to stop carrying all this anger, all this pain. But the other part of me knows that if I let it go, if I stop fighting, I won't be the woman I am now. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. But I don't know if I can ever be truly at peace, not after everything I've been through." Darren reached out, placing a hand on hers, his touch firm but gentle. He understood more than she knew. He had seen the toll that the years had taken on her, the scars she wore beneath her calm exterior. But he also knew that Maya was stronger than most people could ever comprehend. She had fought wars on foreign soil, but the battles she fought every day in her own heart were the ones that truly defined her. "You don't have to fight every battle alone, Maya," Darren said quietly, his voice full of reassurance. "I'm here. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Maya met his gaze, her eyes softening just a little. "I know," she whispered, "but it's hard. It's hard to let go of the weight." The diner door opened again, and the moment between them shifted. A new customer had entered, an older man with a friendly smile, who greeted the staff behind the counter. The change in atmosphere was subtle, but it was enough to pull Maya's attention away from the conversation. She took a deep breath, gathering herself. "You should talk about it more," Darren said, his voice gentle but insistent. "You know, sharing some of the weight with someone else, it might help. You don't have to hold it all in." Maya looked at him, a fleeting smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but not today." Darren chuckled softly, nodding in understanding. "All right, but one day, Maya, one day you'll see that it's okay to let the weight go." Maya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee, her thoughts swirling in the quiet of the diner. The world outside had returned to its usual pace, the sun continuing its slow descent into the horizon, casting long shadows over the small town. But inside, the weight of what had happened lingered, a reminder of how quickly things could shift. As the minutes passed, the diner slowly began to settle back into its normal rhythm. The jukebox played an old blues tune, its mournful notes filling the space with the kind of melody that made you reflect, made you pause. The staff went back to their work, the clink of silverware and the sizzle of the grill becoming the soundtrack of the evening. Maya took another slow sip of her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, grounding her in the present. It was in these quiet moments, between the chaos, that she found her peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its scars, but it was hers. "Are you ready to go?" Darren asked after a few moments, his voice breaking through her reverie. Maya looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the faintest spark of contentment. "Yeah," she said softly. "Let's go home." As they stood up to leave, the last of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, their sound now a mere memory. The small town of Cedar Valley was calm once more, the night settling in, carrying with it the quiet understanding that, no matter what battles came next, Maya Caldwell was ready for them. She had already proven she could face anything, and no matter the weight she carried, she would always rise again. The unseen strength. The road stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt that seemed to lead into the horizon, where the dying light of the day met the sky in hues of gold and lavender. The peacefulness of the open road was a sharp contrast to the chaos they had just witnessed in Betty's diner. Yet, as Maya sat in the passenger seat of the car, she couldn't shake the sense that the world she had just encountered inside that small diner wasn't the world she belonged to anymore. Her thoughts were turbulent, clouded with memories, emotions, and a question that had been lingering at the edge of her mind for years. Was she truly at peace? Darren, who had always been more than just a brother to Maya, drove silently. He was used to Maya's quiet moments, the ones where she would retreat into herself, her thoughts heavy with the weight of a life that most people couldn't understand. Maya wasn't the kind of woman who wore her emotions on her sleeve. She wasn't even the kind of woman who shared them with anyone. But Darren knew her well enough to understand when she was processing, when her mind was running miles ahead of her body, taking her places she couldn't quite articulate. "Are you thinking about it again?" Darren asked, his voice low but filled with the warmth and concern that Maya knew so well. Maya didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed out the window, watching the scenery change as they passed through fields and small houses. The world outside was still, peaceful, nothing like the world she had once known. Nothing like the chaos she had learned to live with. "How long has it been, Darren?" Maya finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since I came home." Darren's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but his gaze remained focused on the road ahead. "It's been years, Maya. Almost a decade." A decade. Maya let the word linger in her mind, savoring the weight of it. She had been gone for so long, yet sometimes it felt as though the world had remained stuck in time, waiting for her to return. The idea of coming back, of re-entering civilian life, had been one of the hardest things she had ever done. She had thought that once she left the military, things would return to normal, that she could slip back into the life she had known before everything had changed. But life had a way of presenting challenges in ways that no one could anticipate. The truth was, Maya had never really left the military, not in the way that people expected her to. It was always with her, every mission, every decision, every person she had lost. The weight of that history had become a constant companion, and the moments of peace she saw out seemed fleeting, as though the world didn't quite know what to make of her after all those years. Darren's voice broke through her thoughts again, this time with a gentle tone, as though he could sense the emotional toll the past was taking on her. "Do you ever think about the people you left behind?" he asked, his question hanging in the air. Maya's hand tightened on the seatbelt, a small movement that spoke volumes. She didn't need to ask who he was referring to. There was one person above all others who had haunted her thoughts for years, the soldier she had once been, and the comrades she had lost along the way. She had never talked about them with Darren, not in detail, at least. The pain was too raw, too real, and no one could understand it. Not like Darren, who had his own ghosts to face. "I think about them every day," Maya replied, her voice steady, though there was an underlying tremor in her words. "I think about what we went through, about how we survived, how many of us didn't, and how many times I didn't know if I was going to make it out myself." Darren nodded, keeping his eyes on the road, but never once breaking the connection between them. He didn't need to ask her more. He knew the toll those memories took on her. And he knew that Maya, as strong as she was, had never fully healed. The scars, both visible and invisible, were etched into her soul, a part of her that she had learned to live with, but that didn't mean they didn't hurt. "You've done more than survive, Maya," Darren said, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. "You've built a life, a good life. You've helped people, you've been there for your friends. You've done everything anyone could ever ask of you." Maya's lips tightened at his words, but she didn't argue. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate Darren's praise. It was that she didn't know if she could truly accept it. She had spent so many years being trained to fight, to protect, to lead, that when she was no longer in uniform, when she was back in the real world, she didn't know what her role was anymore. She had always been the one who took charge, the one who had to make the hard decisions. But now, in the quiet moments, it was hard to reconcile that part of herself with the person she was becoming. "Maybe," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. "But I don't know if I'm done fighting yet. Not inside. I still feel like I'm in the middle of something I can't escape." Darren's gaze softened as he glanced over at her, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade into the background. The conversation, the weight of their shared history, hung between them like a silent understanding. "You're not alone, Maya," Darren said softly. "You never have been. And you don't have to fight every battle on your own. I'm here. I'll always be here, no matter what." Maya looked at him then, really looked at him. She could see the quiet resolve in his eyes, the unspoken promise that had been there since they were kids. No matter what, Darren had always been there, a steady anchor in the storm. But even his unwavering support couldn't fully fill the void that Maya felt. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate him. It was that she didn't know how to ask for help, didn't know how to rely on anyone after so many years of standing alone. "I know," she whispered, a small, sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But it's hard to trust, Darren. It's hard to let go of the fear that's always been there." Darren nodded in understanding, not pressing her any further. He knew that trust, for Maya, was something that had to be earned, something that couldn't be rushed. She had spent years fighting for herself and for those around her, and somewhere along the way, she had learned to trust only her own strength. As they continued down the road, the sky darkened, the world around them gradually shifting into night. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, their yellow glow offering little warmth. Maya leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closing for just a moment. She had never truly stopped moving, never truly allowed herself the chance to breathe. But tonight, as the car hummed steadily along the road, something inside her shifted. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the comfort of silence, the weight of the world momentarily lifting from her shoulders. "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" Maya asked, her voice low and uncertain. Darren didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, he had often wondered the same thing. What did life look like after everything they had been through? What came after the chaos, after the years of battle and loss? Could they ever truly find peace, or was it something that could only be glimpsed from a distance, like a mirage in the desert? Instead of answering directly, Darren reached over and placed his hand gently on Maya's. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything she needed to hear. "We'll figure it out," Darren said, his voice steady and reassuring. "One step at a time." Maya's grip on his hand tightened just slightly, the silent promise hanging between them. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what the future held. But they knew one thing for sure. They weren't in this alone. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As the car continued down the road, the world outside fading into the darkness, Maya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the battles she had fought weren't over. But there was hope now. Hope that, in time, she could find peace. A peace that didn't come from victory or survival, but from the quiet strength of knowing that she was no longer alone. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like a victory all on its own. The burden of the past. The soft hum of the car's engine was the only sound that accompanied Maya and Darren as they made their way down the winding highway. The world outside the car had grown darker, the stretch of road illuminated only by the occasional flicker of headlights from oncoming traffic. Yet inside the car, the weight of the conversation and the years of history between them hung heavy in the air. Maya sat in silence, her gaze fixed out the passenger window, watching the world blur by as her thoughts churned. She had spent so much of her life moving forward, always running from one mission to the next, from one challenge to the next. But now, as she sat beside Darren, her mind was no longer focused on the present or the future. Instead, it was drawn back to the past, the things she had buried, the things she had never spoken of. Darren had always known Maya was haunted by her time in the military. He had seen the way her eyes would cloud over when certain memories crept into her mind, how her shoulders would tense when certain topics were brought up. But he had never pushed her to talk about it. He knew better than anyone that Maya would open up when she was ready. But tonight, he could sense something different, something more fragile, more vulnerable. He had seen this side of her before, in the quiet moments after a mission, when the adrenaline had faded and the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. "You've been quiet for a while," Darren said, his voice breaking the silence. He glanced over at her, noting the faraway look in her eyes. "What's on your mind, Maya?" Maya's fingers gripped the armrest tighter, her knuckles white. The question caught her off guard, as if she had been expecting it but didn't know how to answer. She wasn't sure if she was ready to speak, to bring up the things she had locked away for so long, the things that had shaped her, scarred her, and made her who she was today. "I think," Maya began, her voice trembling slightly, I think I've spent so much time running from the past that I've never really stopped to face it. Darren didn't say anything at first. He simply listened, knowing that Maya would reveal what she needed to in her own time. But he knew that the pain she carried had never truly gone away. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface. I've spent years trying to bury everything I saw, everything I did. Maya continued, her voice growing softer. But it never really leaves you. No matter how far you go, no matter how many people you help, the past always catches up with you. Darren shifted in his seat, his heart aching for her. He had always admired Maya's strength, her ability to push forward, to keep moving no matter how hard things got. But hearing her speak this way, hearing the rawness in her voice, made him realize just how much of herself she had sacrificed in order to survive. How much of her humanity she had buried beneath the weight of her service. "You don't have to carry all of it alone, Maya," Darren said quietly, his tone full of empathy. "I know it's hard, but you don't have to keep running from your past. You're not the same person you were then. You've changed. You've grown." Maya looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and exhaustion. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the person she had become was someone who had transcended the horrors of her past. But deep down, she knew that she couldn't just erase those experiences. They were a part of her, woven into the very fabric of who she was. "I don't know how to let go, Darren," Maya admitted, her voice small. "I don't know how to move on when I still feel like I'm carrying all that weight." Darren didn't respond immediately. He knew that Maya's struggle wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words. It wasn't something that could be solved with logic or reason. Her pain was real, and it had shaped her in ways that no one, not even Darren, could fully understand. "I get it," Darren said finally, his voice steady and reassuring. "I don't have all the answers, Maya. But what I do know is that you don't have to keep carrying it by yourself. You don't have to keep holding on to all of that pain. You don't have to carry it forever." Maya didn't reply. She sat back in her seat, her eyes closed, her mind filled with a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She knew that Darren was right. She didn't have to carry the weight alone. But that didn't make it any easier to let go. The pain, the guilt, the loss, those things had been with her for so long, they felt like a part of her identity. And the thought of surrendering them, of allowing herself to be vulnerable enough to let them go, was terrifying. The road ahead was dark, the only light coming from the headlights of their car and the occasional street lamp that flickered on the side of the road. The quiet stillness in the car seemed to stretch on forever, and Maya found herself retreating back into her own thoughts, her own world. She didn't know how to move forward. She didn't know how to confront the past that had been following her for so long. And yet there was a part of her that knew she couldn't keep running. She had built a new life, one that was full of purpose, of meaning, but that life would never feel complete until she found a way to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was becoming. The weight of her past had always been there, and no matter how many times she tried to outrun it, she knew it would eventually catch up to her. Darren broke the silence again, his voice soft but firm. "Maya, you can't keep fighting yourself forever. The person you are now, the person you're becoming, isn't defined by your past. It's defined by what you choose to do with it. You can't change what happened, but you can control what happens next." Maya looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to see the truth in his words. She had been running for so long, hiding from the things that had shaped her, but she didn't have to keep running. She could choose to face them, and in doing so, maybe, just maybe, she could find the peace that had always eluded her. "I don't know if I'm ready," Maya said, her voice trembling with uncertainty, "but I think I want to try." Darren's gaze softened, and he nodded. "That's all I'm asking, Maya. Just try, one step at a time." As the car continued down the road, Maya took a deep breath, feeling a sense of quiet determination stirring within her. She wasn't sure how it would all unfold or how long it would take, But for the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about finding the perfect ending, but about the courage to face each new day with the strength to keep moving forward. The past had shaped her, but it didn't have to define her. The future was still unwritten, and Maya was ready to begin the next chapter. Slowly, cautiously, she was learning that healing didn't come from forgetting. It came from confronting the past and choosing to move forward, no matter how difficult that might be. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, Maya was ready to stop running, to let go of the past, and finally, to find peace. Facing the future. The city lights began to twinkle in the distance as the car made its way down the winding road, and the hum of the engine seemed to match the rhythm of Maya's thoughts. The world outside felt as though it were moving in a blur, but Maya was slowing down, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. The weight of the conversation with Darren still lingered in the air between them, and though she wasn't sure where this path would lead her, she knew something had shifted inside of her. It had taken years of running, both physically and mentally, for Maya to even begin to accept the possibility that peace might be within her reach. There was always a fear that confronting her past would only open old wounds, that the scars she had fought so hard to keep hidden would be torn open once again. But now, for the first time in years, she was beginning to understand that facing her past didn't mean it would control her. It didn't mean that she would lose who she was now. Instead, it meant she could finally find a way to make peace with the person she had become. Darren, who had been silent for the past few miles, broke the stillness in the car. "You know, Maya," he began, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of sincerity, "you don't have to have it all figured out right now. It's okay to not know what comes next." Maya glanced over at him, her gaze softening, and she offered a faint smile. "I think I've spent so many years trying to figure it out, trying to have all the answers. But maybe it's okay not to know." She paused, staring out at the dark highway again, the silence wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. "For once, maybe I just want to see where this road leads." Darren nodded, his expression one of quiet understanding. He knew Maya had always been a woman of action, of purpose. She had built a life of discipline and duty, and for so long, that structure had defined her. But now, for the first time, he saw her allowing herself the space to just be, to not feel the constant pressure of needing to know what came next, to let go of the burden of perfection and embrace the uncertainty that life often brought. "I think that's the hardest part, isn't it?" Darren mused, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. "Letting go of the need to control everything, to know every outcome. Sometimes the hardest thing is just trusting that things will work out, even if you can't see the whole picture." Maya's eyes moved back to the road, the soft glow of the headlights illuminating the path ahead. She had spent so many years trying to control her world, trying to dictate the narrative of her life. But that constant drive had left her feeling exhausted, as if she were running on empty. And now she was learning, slowly but surely, that it was okay to step back, to breathe, and to simply trust the process. "I think I've been trying to outrun the unknown," Maya admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe that's the lesson. Maybe it's about learning to live with it instead of running from it." Darren glanced at her briefly, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Maybe. But it's hard, right? Letting go of everything you've held onto for so long." Maya nodded, her mind still grappling with the concept. "It's terrifying, actually," she said. "Letting go of the control I've always had, letting go of the idea that I could fix everything. I've spent so much of my life trying to make sure nothing slips through the cracks. But it's like I'm finally realizing I can't fix everything. I can't even fix myself." Darren's expression softened, his voice low but filled with reassurance. "You don't need to fix yourself, Maya. You're not broken. You've just been carrying a weight that no one should have to carry alone. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is put that weight down, even if just for a moment." The truth in Darren's words hit Maya like a wave, and she let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. He was right. She wasn't broken. She had simply been trying to hold herself together for too long, trying to force a picture of herself that was never meant to exist. The idea of perfection, of always being in control, was a lie she had told herself to survive. But now she was beginning to understand that perfection wasn't the goal. Healing was. And healing wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about accepting what had been and learning to live with it. As they continued down the road, the miles seemed to stretch before them, but Maya didn't feel the familiar pull to rush anymore. She didn't feel the need to get to the next place, to the next thing, the next challenge. For once, she was simply present. The world outside might be changing, but Maya was learning to exist in the moment, to experience life as it came instead of rushing toward the finish line. Eventually, Darren turned the car off the highway and onto a quieter, less traveled road that wound its way through a small forest. The dense trees above created a canopy of shadows that filtered the light from the moon, casting a soft glow over the road. Maya looked out at the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. "Do you ever miss it?" Darren asked, breaking the silence again. "The military, I mean. The structure. The certainty." Maya thought for a moment, the question catching her off guard. The truth was, she had always been a soldier at heart. The structure, the discipline, the clear-cut missions, they had all provided a sense of purpose, of belonging, that she had never really found anywhere else. But the cost of that life had been steep, and in the quiet moments, she could feel the toll it had taken on her soul. "I missed the clarity, sometimes," Maya replied after a long pause. "The sense that everything had a purpose, that each decision was part of something bigger. But I don't miss the fear, the constant weight of knowing that any decision could cost someone their life. I don't miss that pressure." Darren nodded, understanding. "Yeah, I get that. It's hard to turn off that part of yourself when you've lived with it for so long. But you don't have to carry that weight anymore, Maya. You don't have to feel like every choice is life or death." Maya looked over at Darren, and for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to relax, to let go of the guard she had been holding up for so long. She wasn't the same person she had been when she left the military. She had changed, grown, learned new things about herself and about the world around her. And for the first time, she could see that the change wasn't a threat. It was a part of who she was becoming. "I don't know where this road is going, Darren," Maya said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "But I think I'm ready to start walking it, without looking back." Darren gave a small, encouraging smile. "I know you are. And you don't have to walk it alone. Not anymore." The words resonated within her, a balm to the wounds she had carried for so long. Maya didn't know what the future held. She didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. She was ready to face it, step by step. The road ahead was long, and the past would always be a part of her. But Maya was learning to walk forward without the burden of it holding her back. As the car continued down the winding road, the sound of the tires against the pavement soothing in its steadiness, Maya allowed herself a deep breath, the kind that came from the heart. She was ready to face the future. She was ready to embrace the unknown and the journey it promised. And for the first time in years, she felt like the future might just hold something beautiful after all.